second stage. The Savage Boys held on to 7th. Despite bending the sump guard on a rock, they were still staying ahead of Father Jonathan in the more powerful Datsun 260Z. Jonathan was lying 11th after he had been forced to stop to change a puncher and then lost more time when the Ford Escort of Aziz Tejbar got stuck in the sand, blocking the road. Jean-Pierre Mondron rounded off the top 10, the Kronos Porsche not reporting any problems. The beautiful Mercedes 450 SL of Marzia Kravos and Renzo Bernardi was also making steady progress back up the leaderboard. The deep-throated V8 could be heard rumbling through the stage for miles. Andrew Siddall and Mike Borissow had a very frustrating day. Breaking a wheel in the first stage, then a fuel pump fuse failed and they were forced to wire the pump directly to the battery. They were down to 26. Roddy Sachs in the third of the South African 180Bs was also having a miserable day, breaking a drive shaft in the first stage and then having 2 punctures. The Alpine of Charles Firmenich and Jean-Pierre Martin was still running despite problems with the rear suspension. The bump stops had failed, causing the damper to overstroke and break its valves. Harder bump stops were fitted and the car would be ready to start the next day.
First middle stage, we can only do 150 in this thing, and we were flat the whole time. Amazing. I don't know what it must be like, these guys who can do 200. That must be quite scary.
The second one is so fast, and I'm at about 170 kilometers per hour, and I can push more, but not in my mind.
The crews would head into Tanzania, crossing the border at Taveta, before 2 stages near the Pare Mountains, then a long transport stage to Sanya Dju, where they would tackle the stage to Longido, sandwiched between Africa's highest peak Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Meru. It would be a tough day where tactics and caution would need to play roles. Early morning rain again meant that the drivers would face slippery conditions with low cloud hanging over the mountains. The border crossing at Taveta was again well organised, with the organisers setting a target time of 2 minutes to clear competitors through. No mean feat for this normally sleepy crossing. Duncan was once again fastest on the opening 2 stages. The mighty Mustang took 26 seconds out of Voldegaard on the first stage, then 42 seconds on the second. Ian was surprised to be faster on the tight and twisty section, which should have favoured the Porsche. Gerard Marcy was 3rd fastest on the first stage before disaster struck on the second. He hit an innocuous rut, puncturing a tyre and bending the rear trailing arm of the suspension. The subsequent time loss dropped him to 15th and out of contention. Paul-Éric Jarry and Jean-François Andrioli in another Tuthill Porsche was 4th fastest on the opening stage and climbed up the leaderboard to 7th. They found the 2nd and 3rd stages very tough, but were happy with their progress. Steve Troman set 2 5th fastest times, moving them into the top 10. Despite a cautious approach to this river crossing, their steady pace was rewarded as those ahead hit problems. Stage 2 would be the end of the road for South African Wayne Kieswetter. He hit a drift hard, flipping his car end over end. The car was a write-off and Wayne suffered a broken clavicle bone in his shoulder. The medical helicopter was quickly on hand before an ambulance was called to take Wayne to the airport, where he flew back to South Africa. The sister car of Roddy Sachs would also come unstuck in the second section, also rolling. The damage was not quite as severe, and both driver and navigator escaped with minor bruising. The car unfortunately landed between 2 trees, making recovery very difficult. They would not complete the last 2 stages, and the car was taken back to Arusha for repairs. Voldegaard dropped 2 minutes and 22 seconds to Duncan, at one point believing he'd picked up a puncture in the deep ruts. He was 2nd fastest on all the day's stages, but could not keep up the pace of the Kenyan ahead. Steve Perez climbed up to finish the day in 3rd, despite a scare at the same drift where Kieswetter rolled. On the 3rd stage he got stuck in the mud and would end the day 24 minutes down on Voldegaard. Graham Alexander had had to drive cautiously after being unable to repair the engine mountings in Taita, so he drove the whole day with the engine held in with straps. He dropped down to 5th behind Jeff Bell, but was still 4th fastest through the 3rd stage. Jeff Bell moved into 4th overall, despite losing time on the 3rd stage when they had 2 punchers, both on the navigator's side. The 180B was still running without a hitch, and Jeff was still pushing the car to the maximum. Rally newcomer Thomas Floor was another driver setting consistent times. With experienced navigator Didier Breton guiding him through the stages and his Porsche running trouble-free, he had climbed up to an impressive 6th overall and was delighted with his progress. Jonathan Savage climbed up to 8th despite 2 punches and driving up a bank when the steering wheel was snapped out of his hands. Quentin and Russell had not fared so well, bending a tie rod end, costing them dearly and dropping them down to 17th. Aziz Tejbar was driving with a sprained wrist and found the tight and twisty uphill on the 2nd stage very difficult. He was another driver making steady progress and was up to 11th overall. The Bussolinis broke a wheel, but otherwise they had a trouble-free day in their 924, and Jean-Marc was enjoying the challenging roads. Duncan was once again fastest, but lost both wing lights on bushes as he battled to keep the car in a straight line through the river that flowed down the road. He also had a clutch problem that made driving back to the rest halt in traffic a little tricky.
Yeah, no, it's working really good actually. Starting to feel a bit old, but otherwise it's doing great. The first one was like they had a lot of rain in the night. They had lots of new washaways and booby traps in it. That was a bit frightening. The next one up in the hills was all foggy and slippery. That was quite exciting. Then this last one, where we got on a small track, it was a river for 20 kilometres, so that kept us amused for a while. So.
It was just muddy in this last section. It was just couldn't keep it straight and it clipped a tree at the last minute.
We have a lot of issues at the beginning. It was something wrong in the wiring of the car, and we burned 4 alternators, 5 coils before we managed to find out what was wrong. So now on that side it's fine.
Eric Comas had been unable to compete on any of the day's stages after a broken gearbox mount on the Alpine. He was now treating the rally as an extended test session to develop the car for the next event, but was determined to get to the finish. Gianluca Ciraldi was another driver struggling. They broke the suspension on the transport stage out of Kenya, losing a lot of time. They ended the day in 23rd. Day 4 would consist of only 2 stages, centred around Lake Manyara. The first stage was a steep climb up the Mbulu Escarpment, an old Safari Classic stage, followed by a fast 70-kilometre sprint to Karatu. This stage was likened to New Zealand, with its fast sweeping bends and cambered corners. Those with enough time to look out the window would have been able to see the world-famous Ngorongoro crater as the route ended just 5 kilometres from the rim. With the stunning backdrop of Lake Manyara, the first stage was once again slippery and wet, with a large river crossing to negotiate before even beginning the climb up the escarpment. With a long transport section to the start of the day's stages, drivers had a chance to relax and catch up before the start. The cars could be seen for miles from vantage points as they snaked their way up the tricky section. This would be tough on the forearms as drivers fought hairpin after hairpin. This time it was Voldegaard's turn to fight back. He was fastest up the steep escarpment, taking 1 minute 56 seconds out of Duncan's lead. His speed was deceptive as he kept the Porsche neat and tidy around the corners. Duncan was only 3rd fastest, fighting to balance the power of the big V8 whilst getting the bulky car around the slow hairpins.